It's about that time. We've got kind of a jam-packed session, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rob Howard. I'm a program manager on the SharePoint Developer Experience team, and I'm really excited today to be talking to you about developing hybrid apps for SharePoint. These are apps that work on-prem, online, from a single code base, can be deployed in either place or in both, and really kind of bridge the gap between customers that are running on-premises and customers that are moving from on-prem to online, and customers that are already in Office 365. I just want to take a couple of quick surveys here. So how many of you guys are from a partner, an ISV, that is interested in selling a solution that has a single code base, but it works for customers who are in Office 365 and on-prem? How many people for that is the scenario? Awesome. Okay, and for how many people do you have an environment where you have some portion of your SharePoint deployment on-prem and some portion of your SharePoint deployment online, and you want to create a single app that can talk to both of those things? Okay, still a pretty decent number. Sounds good. And for how many people do you have a customer in transition? So you're working with someone who's moving from on-prem. They are fully on-prem today. They want to get to online, but they have a bunch of custom solutions that they need to move, and they need to be able to migrate. All right, that seems like the biggest one. Cool. Well, we're going to cover all those scenarios today. We're going to talk about them in pretty good depth. I'll give you a real quick warning right now so that you can run and go to another session if you really want to. We're going to get really in-depth about this. We're going to get down to the token details. We're going to get to encoding, and we're going to go into JSON formats and audience claims and issuers and all kinds of stuff. So if that's going to make you squeamish, my feelings will not be hurt if you run and go to a different session real quick. Awesome. All right, one last thing. How many people were in my talk on understanding authentication for SharePoint apps on Tuesday? All right, so I apologize to you guys. You're going to get about 10 minutes of review, but just 10 minutes. I promise I'll go quick. Because I want to make sure everybody has kind of a level set on how apps for authentication works in apps for SharePoint. So this is going to be kind of how we do the talk. We're going to start off with a review of how authentication works in apps for SharePoint. Then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the kind of scenarios that we have in mind when we talk about hybrid apps. So the difference between online deployments, on-prem deployments, and what those hybrid deployments and hybrid apps look like. And then we'll get into a lot of detail about a really specific piece of this equation, which actually turns out to be the most important piece for most scenarios, and that is how access tokens, OAuth access tokens, and access token issuers relate to all these different scenarios. And that's where we're going to go into the details about ACS and token issuance and the different claims inside of it and encoding, all that kind of stuff. And then we're going to talk about how to set up a hybrid SharePoint environment. So one of these scenarios that we talked about is when you have both SharePoint on-prem and you have SharePoint online, or you're making that transition, so you're kind of halfway in between. So we're going to talk about exactly how you go to that SharePoint on-prem environment and connect it to your online environment so you can have a single kind of ACS tenant, a single way to manage applications. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about, the last scenario, is how you can create a single app, an app that's a single code base, has just the same set of lines of code, but it will either work in the cloud, when you host the app in the cloud, or in a customer's on-prem environment when they host it behind their firewall. So that's what we're going to cover. If I didn't talk about something that you were expecting me to talk about, you can either ask me afterwards, or maybe you can find another session. I hope that you still have enough time. Well, let's go ahead and get started with the review on apps for SharePoint authentication. So you guys who saw the session on Tuesday, you've heard this story before. This story has nothing to do with SharePoint. This story is about me. And the point of this story is to express to you why this notion of an application principle that we've introduced in this release and is kind of fundamental to the way that apps for SharePoint work, why it's a really important notion. And then also to give me a metaphor that I can kind of point back to when we're talking about all these different protocols. So I'm going to refer back to this story and say, that was this, and we're going to point at access tokens. And so remember this story as we go through the rest of it. So it starts with me. That's me. It's got a label, so you can make sure it's me. And like people heard before, I've told this story quite a bit to try and explain to people why AppAuth is really important, and I kept getting feedback that that doesn't look like me. So I put a beard on it, so it looks a little bit more like me. I use an awesome service called SkyDrive. If you guys haven't tried it, I would highly recommend it. And in particular, I use SkyDrive to store all of my photos. I have a cool Windows 8 phone that uploads all the photos that I take to SkyDrive automatically, and so I have thousands and thousands of photos that sit up in SkyDrive. And SkyDrive gives me a username and a password that allows me to access those photos. It's the way that I prove to SkyDrive who I am. It's kind of my keys to the resources inside of SkyDrive. So I also use another service. This one's fictitious. It's called Contoso Photo, but it's just like a bunch of services I'm sure you've actually used. This one is one where I can go and I can upload some photos. I can upload an album of photos, and I can give them my credit card information and ask them to print off a bunch of photos and send them to me in the mail. This service has another username and password that I give them because they're going to track all my orders, they're going to track my photos, they've got my credit card information, so they want to secure that. They want a way to know that it's me and then I have a right to those resources, so they give me another username and password. And this time it's a Contoso one. They're different usernames and passwords. So I have this service that has photos in it in SkyDrive, and I have a service that prints photos. So there's a very natural question to ask, which is there some way that I can connect that service that prints photos directly to SkyDrive so that instead of having to download the photos from SkyDrive and re-upload them and have the different albums in two different places, I can just go straight to Contoso Photo and say, hey, go over to SkyDrive and print the photos that are in this album. So the question then is, how do I actually implement that? And there's kind of a naive way that you might start with, and there's actually a bunch of services out on the internet that do it this way. It's kind of scary. And that is that I could actually just give Contoso Photo my username and password for SkyDrive, right? And that would work because now both Contoso Photo and I have the same way to prove that we're us. So SkyDrive can't tell the difference between Contoso Photo and Rob. And I have permission to view photos. SkyDrive can't tell the difference between me and Contoso Photo, so Contoso Photo also has permission to view photos now, so they can get to the photos that I have, print them for me, and then send them to me in the mail. There's a problem. One of those problems is that I can do a bunch more stuff in addition to viewing. I can also upload new photos, I can tag photos, I can comment on them. And maybe I think, well, you know, I think Contoso is probably a very trustworthy corporation. I don't think that they're going to upload any sort of weird photos to my SkyDrive account or comment on my friends' photos in embarrassing ways or things like that. But maybe not. I mean, it depends on how much I trust Contoso. And actually, I can do a bunch of worse things. So, for example, I can change my password, because it's my password. And now Contoso Photo can change my password too, which would mean I can't log in anymore. And another thing that's really bad about the fact that SkyDrive can't tell the difference between me and Contoso is that if I decide later that I don't want Contoso to have access to my stuff anymore, what are my options? Well, I can change my username and password. That's about the best that I can do. That's not particularly nice. It's definitely not an elegant way to solve that problem. And it definitely gets worse when there are a bunch of services. So imagine I had 10 different services I wanted to connect to SkyDrive, and then I didn't want to trust Contoso Photo anymore. Now I've got to change my password, and I've got to update it in the other 9 places that I want to continue to access it. So you can see that the core of the problem is when I solve it this way, SkyDrive can't tell the difference between me and Contoso Photo. So it can't give us different access rights to content. It can't say that Contoso Photo can only do a certain set of things compared to Rob. And I can never go and tell SkyDrive, hey, I don't want Contoso Photo to be able to access my stuff anymore because SkyDrive doesn't know who Contoso Photo is. It's only got my username and password. So there's a better way to solve this problem, and I'm going to kind of give you the metaphor here, and this is the one to kind of hold on to as we're going through the rest of it because I'm going to refer back to this metaphor quite a bit. And that is that I give Contoso Photo a note. And this note is signed by me. It's got me in that note. So SkyDrive knows that Rob said, this is for Contoso Photo. And I put the beard on there too, so it's legitimate. And Contoso Photo, and this note says exactly what Contoso Photo is allowed to do to my SkyDrive. Just view photos. It can't do any of the other things that Rob's allowed to do. And I can even put a time limit on this note. I can say, hey, this note's only good till tomorrow after Contoso has already printed all my photos, and then it expires. So if Contoso shows up at SkyDrive with the note, it says, sorry, you got to go back and get a new note because this one's no good anymore. So this is a much better way to solve the problem. It allows SkyDrive to tell the difference between me and Contoso Photo, give us different levels of access. I can even go to SkyDrive and say, hey, SkyDrive, if Contoso Photo shows up with that note I gave them, ignore it. I don't want to trust them anymore because SkyDrive knows about that note and can when that shows up, tell the difference between me and SkyDrive and Contoso Photo now. So that that story didn't really have anything directly to do with SharePoint. I think probably a lot of you guys are starting to see how it actually fits in, but I'll go through this in order to explain really how it fits into SharePoint and how this in particular fits into the discussion today about building these hybrid apps. And I'm going to do that by talking about sort of the evolution of the SharePoint app model. So in SharePoint 2007, I'm sure a lot of you guys were with us at that point doing all kinds of development on SharePoint. It was a very different world. We had server code, custom server code, running directly on servers in proc in W3WP, and that was kind of the gold standard for developing customizations on top of SharePoint. This actually turns out to be a really big problem because those solutions, if they're buggy, if they're resource intensive, if they make calls out that have to leave box and leave threads open, they're all in the same process that SharePoint's running in, and so they cause problems for everybody on the farm. Even if it's a multi-tenant environment, we're all running in that same process, and those custom solutions are as well. So they end up causing a huge amount of the problems that people run into in their SharePoint deployments. So in 2010, we did a bunch of work trying to solve this problem. We created something called the sandbox. And in principle, the sandbox is pretty cool. It allows you to take custom code and run it on the SharePoint server in kind of this box that we have set aside that's in a different process. It's very limited in the resources it can use and the types of things it can use to make sure it doesn't do anything dangerous. And it's aware of tenancy, so it separates my code from another guy's code in the same farm if we're in two different tenants. So it's a pretty powerful infrastructure. But as I mentioned, it's very limited. Because we want to make sure it's safe, we limit it in a lot of ways. And it turns out that most of those ways make it very difficult to use for a lot of real scenarios. For example, if you can't get your work done in 30 seconds, we're going to kill that sandbox process because we're worried that it may be running away with itself. And if you want to make an off-box call, the sandbox is not good for you either because we prevent that sandbox from making those calls on the network directly from there. So it turns out that this model, while in principle allowed people to create custom code a little more freely, it actually was so limited that it didn't really allow people to accomplish a lot of useful scenarios. So in SharePoint 2013, we have a different model. And that is that we've really focused on enabling you to create your custom server code on whatever server stack you want. So that's that top right box there, whether it's on Windows Azure, or it's on an IIS server that you host, or it's, God forbid, on the LAMP stack, Ruby on Rails, PHP, whatever you want to write on, you can write your custom server code in that location. And you can host it yourself, or you can give it to us and we'll automatically host it in an Azure account associated with Office 365. And we really focused then on making the connection between that service and SharePoint very powerful by creating a bunch of new capabilities from the API side. So we expanded our client object model dramatically. And we also invented or extended the protocols that can interact with that client object model by adding REST. So you can get to SharePoint APIs, for example, from PHP, Ruby on Rails, from iPhones, from things that don't run .NET or JavaScript. And we also focused heavily on the authentication model to make it so that you can do really powerful things from that remote server, the types of things that people are used to doing when they're on box on SharePoint. Things like running with elevated privileges or creating a timer job that wakes up every hour or so and calls back into SharePoint. So we did a bunch of work to make sure that that kind of functionality, while not available in the sandbox, is available in this new environment when you have this freedom to run on your own server platform. And the next feature, the other feature that I want to really mention here is that this model is optimized for being consistent on premises and in the cloud. The entire idea is that we wanted a model that we can enable people to build a single solution, host it where they want to host it, and allow it to connect to both Office 365 and SharePoint on-prem because we have a single place, or we have a single consistent API across those two, and we have a single infrastructure for doing the authentication from those two places. Now, that sounds great. There are a lot of actually kind of challenging details about exactly how you do those connections, and that's what this talk is going to go into detail about for the rest of the 75 minutes we have. All right, so remember, we've got SkyDrive on one side that's got an interesting resource that a service wants to get to. We've got another service outside of SkyDrive, Contoso Photo, and Contoso Photo gets a note from a user to interact with that resource on SkyDrive. If you think about that picture and you look at this model, where you see your service running an Azure IaaS, LAMP, etc., and you see that service interacting with SharePoint and looking to get at the interesting resources SharePoint has, like lists and libraries and documents and user profiles and taxonomies, this is very much the same dynamic. We're talking about the same kind of situation here, where your service is playing the role of Contoso and SharePoint's playing the role of SkyDrive. So keep that metaphor in mind as we go through the rest of this. All right, let's take just a minute and kind of level set on the kind of scenarios we're talking about when we talk about hybrid apps and hybrid SharePoint deployments. I kind of talked about them when I was taking a survey at the beginning of the talk. But let's talk about kind of the three main flavors that we intend when we talk about hybrid. So the first is kind of the one where we're talking about if you're a partner, an ISV, and you want to sell something. You want to write a single code base, and you want to use that code base both in your online offering that maybe you put up in the SharePoint store, or maybe you sell directly through the catalog, and your on-prem offering that you actually have a direct relationship with customers and you have them install something on their SharePoint farm or on another farm behind their firewall. So creating that single code base that runs in both of those places is one of the primary scenarios that we're going to talk about here. The next is for those people who are kind of bridging the gap between online and on-prem. They have things in both places. They have a tenant in Office 365 and they have on-premises servers, and they want to create a single app that can talk to both locations, that can bridge the gap between on-prem and online and connect that data. And the last is the ability to take an app running in the cloud or an app running on-prem and talk with a SharePoint server that's in the opposite location. So you have an app on-prem and you want to talk to Office 365 in the cloud. That's one form of hybrid scenario. Or if you have an app in the cloud and you want to talk to SharePoint on-prem, that's another form of hybrid scenario. So those are the kind of three that we're going to cover, and we're going to now go into a little bit more detail about what those look like. And after that, we're going to dive into the exact sort of technical specifications for how those protocols work and the differences between them. All right, so app identity, that notion of the app principle, identifying Contoso Photo versus Rob, works both online and on-prem. And we kind of separate out the three different scenarios into three different cases. And the first one we talk about is the online scenario. We talk about in the cloud. And the way that works is when you get an Office 365 tenant, you actually get an Azure AD instance with it. It automatically is created for you behind the scenes. It's just provisioned as part of tenant provisioning when you sign up. If you go get a dev tenant, you've got one. You may not even know about it. And Azure AD is the thing that keeps track of all the users' identities and the app's identities. That's where when you go and create a new app, something is listed there as a new app principal. And Azure also plays the role of the STS, of the token server. So it's creating all the tokens that go back and forth between your app and Office 365. We'll see a little bit more about that in a minute. So this is the cloud scenario. The second scenario is the on-premises scenario. And the on-premises scenario allows apps and SharePoint to connect to one another. You can use the same sort of APIs that you can use in the cloud. You can have that single code base. But the way that you get tokens is slightly different because there is no Azure AD on premises. So it's just your app connecting directly to SharePoint, a direct server-to-server connection. You may have been in a talk talking about on-prem development where they talked about S to S or high trust. That's this type of connection. And this works by cert-based trust. So the app has a cert that SharePoint trusts to issue tokens in order to communicate with SharePoint. And then the last scenario is a hybrid scenario, where you're using Azure AD to connect elements across this boundary of on-prem and online. You can even use sort of a hybrid scenario to take an on-prem app and connect to an on-prem SharePoint in order to make it look more like online. In fact, it looks pretty much exactly like online. But you can also use it to take an app from on-prem and talk to Office 365, or to take an app from online and to talk to SharePoint on-prem. And this sort of environment is also the environment that a bunch of out-of-the-box features related to hybrid are built on. So for example, we have a search capability that allows you to connect a SharePoint Online environment with a SharePoint on-prem environment, and allows you to do a single search query and get back two result sets, one from Office 365 and one from SharePoint. And in that case, the connection is actually directly from Office 365 to SharePoint through Azure AD, or vice versa. And it's running on that same infrastructure that we'll talk about. All right, so this is kind of the picture of what the scenarios look like. Let's talk a little bit about what the challenges are and why hybrid's not just so straightforward that it just works without you having to do any thinking or doing any work. The first one is very straightforward, and that is that right now there's no support for auto-hosted apps in on-prem farms. So Office 365 is the one location where you can give a web deploy package to SharePoint and we'll automatically host it for you in Azure. I'm sure you can imagine sometime in the future us allowing customers to configure an IIS server on-prem where you could host those same web deploy packages. That's not a capability we have right now. So keep in mind that when you create auto-hosted apps, those things are only going to be available in Office 365. The next issue, and we'll talk about some ways of solving this and where this kind of comes up along the way, is that if you have an app in the cloud and you want to talk to a SharePoint server on-prem that's behind a firewall, you're going to run into potential issues. And there's a bunch of different ways to deal with that. One of the ways is just have your SharePoint server accessible to the internet. And for a lot of people, that's an acceptable solution. For a lot of other customers, that's not an acceptable solution. And so we have some other things that we'll talk about in order to deal with that particular problem near the end of the talk. And the last one is that Azure AD is only available as part of Office 365. So when you have that on-prem environment, you don't have Azure AD there to issue the tokens. And that's why things work slightly differently when you're connecting between on-prem environments and online or hybrid environments. So those are kind of the challenges that I want to make sure you are aware of. The next thing I want to talk about is some cases that actually do just work. And there's actually a couple of scenarios to talk about. One of them is SharePoint hosted apps. So the way that SharePoint hosted apps work is when you install your SharePoint app on the host web, we take all your pages and your lists and your libraries and your content types and things like that, and we put it inside of an isolated app web. We create a new subweb under that host web that end users don't even see. It just is part of that app and managed with the app. And all the content goes inside of that app web. And we host that app web on a different domain from the other content inside of SharePoint. So that JavaScript running inside that app web is isolated to only call back through the endpoint in that app web. It can get the content outside of that app web, but it has to call back through that endpoint. And when this happens, we actually kind of automatically authenticate the app. We say, any time that an app is interacting through an app web, we're automatically going to attribute that to the app without having to have any tokens or do any OAuth or anything like that. And another interesting characteristic of this model is that even if you have a firewall in the middle, so say you're on-prem or you're online and you're trying to interact with these SharePoint hosted apps, firewalls don't generally present a problem because people are crossing these firewalls with their browser by using VPN or connecting to the SharePoint server. The SharePoint app is hosted in the same place the rest of the SharePoint content is. So if they're connected to SharePoint, they don't have a firewall problem to overcome. And so for this reason, SharePoint hosted apps actually work automatically without you doing any work or the customer doing any work for configuration, both online and on-prem. So that's one case that just works. The other case that I'll talk about is very similar. So we also, in addition to having this notion of app webs, have a library called the cross-domain library that allows you as part of your app to say, hey, there's some script on a specific server on www.myapp.com. You have to say exactly where that script is. And when you declare that as part of your app, SharePoint allows you to use a cross-domain library to communicate back and forth with the app web. And because that's all being done through the browser, through a cross-domain library in the browser, you're in the same situation as you are with an app web. You're automatically authenticated. And even though the script is coming from a remote server potentially in the cloud, and you may be crossing a firewall, because you're doing it through the browser, that problem's automatically handled for you, so you don't have to worry about it. So this is kind of the second case that just works. App webs and webs that use cross-domain library, and apps that use cross-domain library. So I'm going to do a really, really quick demo, because I don't want to spend too much time on this, because this is actually one of the cases that just works, so it's not particularly interesting to talk to. But I'm going to go over really quick and just show you a SharePoint hosted app. So I have this online farm. It's in SharePoint Online in Office 365, and I'm in the app catalog. So this is, hopefully you guys are familiar with this at this point in the week. This is a place within my organization where I can host my own apps for people to use within my organization. So this isn't the public store. This is something that I manage. And I'll go to my Apps for SharePoint library. And I'm just going to upload this meeting scheduler app. And this is kind of a little app that I built because I got really frustrated about trying to find times when a bunch of different people could meet and trying to optimize for when was the best time to make other people mad about missing their own meetings. So I built this little mini meeting schedule app, and I want to show it to you because it's really just a very simple app. It's SharePoint hosted. There's only HTML, JavaScript, lists, and libraries. So it runs online and in the online and on-prem. But it is actually a pretty cool little app, I think, anyway. It doesn't look the greatest. So I'm going to go to my site, and I'm going to add it now that it's in the catalog. You can see that it shows up from my organization because it's in the catalog now. So it's called Meetup. I'm going to click Meetup and trust the app. It's going to install here. And what SharePoint's actually doing under the covers is it's taking all of the content, all the pages and the script and the lists and libraries that are part of this Meetup app, and it's provisioning them inside of one of those isolated app webs that's separate from the host web. So I'm installing it in this larger site, and when I click to launch Meetup, I'm actually running inside of an app web. And just to prove it to you, forgot to open magnifier. Just to prove it to you, I'll go up to the top. And you can see that the URL is my tenant's name, Fort Worth 2, but there's this identifier at the front, this -1CE0E part. And that's the part that is unique to this app. So every time script comes in or a user comes in and interacts with that URL, with that domain, we automatically attribute it to this app. And so the way this app works is I have the new events on this side, the just created events. So I'm just going to go and create an event. I'll call it End of Conference Party. Anybody want to come? It's going to be fun. We'll have it today. We'll do it somewhere cool. I can say, hey, I want it to be 2 hours long. I'll invite a few people. And I'll hit save. So what this is I have an event now. I want to plan this event. And the entire point of this app is to say, hey, I want these people to come to the event, but I want to have it at the best time for the most people to be able to make it. So if I click back on this newly created event, you can see that I've got some custom forms. And this is just HTML and JavaScript. It's just using our client APIs and our REST APIs to read information about this event. And it's saying, oh, what are some good times? Maybe 2, 3, 4. Maybe we should do it later at 6. And then when I click Send Out Invitations, this is actually just going to send an email to all the people that were on the invite list with a link to go and vote on when that time should be. And I can go to see this end of conference thing. I can see what the current results are. Here's the voting link. So this is the voting link that allows me to say that the attendees would get. And so they could say yes, no, maybe, submit. I'll fill out another one just so you can see a couple of counts. Say no, no. And if I go back to the main page, you can see that the counts get updated. I can see which ones are most popular. I can choose a time, and I can click to send the invite. And actually, it'll even use JavaScript to generate a new ICS file. and it'll open that JavaScript up in whatever my default calendar is, my default calendar app. Oops. And then you can see I get an invite for the end of conference party. You can see it has the time that I chose, the people that I had were invited. So, I mean, it's a simple little app. Maybe it doesn't look the greatest. I'm not a designer, so it kind of looks scrummy. But you can see that you can actually do some pretty cool stuff, even from, let me close my mail before something comes up. You can see that you can actually do some pretty cool stuff, even from these kind of SharePoint hosted apps. They're relatively simple. They are limited. But you can do some very cool stuff. And that app, I won't demo it twice, but it works equally well online and on-prem. You deploy it, and it works exactly the same in both places. But there are actually quite a few limitations to it. Like I said, you can do cool stuff with it. It's definitely a model that you should look at if you have a simple app. But there are a bunch of limitations. For one, I can't write any custom server-side code. It's all HTML and JavaScript. And so some of the limitations with not being able to write server-side code are things like I can't have functionality that doesn't run based on a user being in a page. That's the only time I can run HTML and JavaScript, right? But there's a lot of situations where maybe I want to have something like a timer job that wakes up every hour and does some processing based on the user identity when a user's not logged in actively. Or maybe I want to have some processing that happens off-box. So when an event happens in SharePoint, I actually want to call out to my app and let some custom code run on a server-side process and have some data outside of SharePoint. Or maybe I want to do privilege elevation, so I actually want to do something in the app that the user couldn't do themselves. So if I had an expense reporting application and I wanted to approve that expense report, I wouldn't want the user to be able to approve it on their own. I want the app to be the only thing that has those permissions. But if I'm in a SharePoint hosted app, I really can't separate out that behavior because I'm always running in the browser. So while SharePoint hosted apps are interesting, they are limited, and there are a bunch of reasons why you may want to choose the last form of authentication, in my opinion, the best form of authentication, which is OAuth. And OAuth allows you to make calls directly from your remote server to SharePoint, to whatever web on SharePoint you want to. They're made from the server side, so there's no cross-domain restrictions or anything like that. And these calls can be on behalf of the user. They can be the app making a direct call on their own. They can be when a user is actually in the browser interacting with the app. They can be using a cache token. They can be hours and hours later. They can happen once a night. You can do privilege elevation. So there's a ton of different kind of things that are available when you choose this model. This model is the one that I was talking about before in the story that I told at the beginning, right? So this is the one where Contoso Photo is this remote service. Oop, I guess I don't have a pointer. Contoso Photo is the remote service, this guy. And SharePoint is SkyDrive here. And OAuth is that message going back and forth in order to provide the authentication. So one thing that I will point out here, though, is that in this situation, if you have a SharePoint server in the cloud and you have SharePoint on-prem, you do actually potentially have a firewall issue. If there's a firewall there, you're making the call through the server, from the server side. And so there's no browser to bridge that firewall gap for you. And you have to bridge it in other ways. And we'll talk about some strategies for that in a little bit. All right. So now we're going to kind of switch gears and we're going to go into the in-depth issues about exactly how all this stuff works. The exact tokens, things called issuers, the formats, the claims, all that kind of stuff. And I'm going to start with a really simple diagram. And this is a remote app talking to SharePoint. This is on a server side. So I have a remote app running in a remote server. I have a SharePoint server that has our _API web service endpoint. And the remote app wants to get access to something inside of SharePoint. So the way that it does that is it makes a call to that _API endpoint, and it passes an access token. There may be a lot of stuff that happens before that, but this is the part I want to focus on right now. It passes something called an access token, which is that note that we were talking about in the initial story. That note may have a bunch of different information about it. It may be signed in a very particular way. But the key thing is that it passes an access token. And when SharePoint gets that access token, it's going to look and see if that access token was signed by somebody that it trusts. That's really the first thing that it's going to check. And on the SharePoint side, the trusted entity that can sign things is called a trusted security token issuer. And those security token issuers are identified by a certificate, because all these access tokens are signed by a certificate. So those issuers are identified by a certificate. So let's look at exactly how that plays out in the token format. So this is an OAuth authenticated request. The body of it is, some of our client object model. It's going through a managed interactive client object model. But the top is the headers of this request. If you opened up Fiddler and you looked at one of your OAuth requests and you checked it out, this is exactly what you'd see. They're going to be a post to an _VTI_bin/client.svc endpoint, which is the same thing as _API. They go to the same place in the end. And in the authorization header, there's a bearer token. And that's the access token right there. It's actually a lot longer than that. And it's really ugly. Not human readable, obviously. It's actually base 64 encoded. So this is just a simple base 64 encoding. And it's also signed. If you were to unencode that access token, just take it and base 64 encode it, decode it, you would end up with something that looks like this. Now this looks like JSON. If you guys are familiar with JavaScript programming, this looks like a JavaScript object, right? So it looks like a JSON object. It turns out that this type of token is called a JSON web token. So it's aptly named. We have a JavaScript object here, and this is a JSON web token. So what it is it's a signed and base 64 encoded JavaScript object notation string. And that's why we have up at the top this JWT. That stands for JSON Web Token. And it's pronounced JOT. For some reason, the people who wrote the specification really felt it necessary to at the first line of the specification, say that it's pronounced JOT and not JWAT or something like that. I don't know. So we have a JOT token here. And there's a couple of interesting things. When we talked about those issuers, when we said when an access token shows up in SharePoint, SharePoint's going to say, do I trust the person who signed this access token? And it's going to figure that out with two things. The first is it's going to look at the thumbprint of this access token. And that thumbprint is the thumbprint of the certificate that signed it. So whoever signed this thing used the certificate with a thumbprint that was 34-64-C5. And SharePoint is going to use that to look up, do I trust anybody who has that thumbprint? And the next thing is, in the body of this token, there's a claim that has the title of ISS, which stands for issuer. An issuer is the identity of the entity that signed this token, that issued and signed this token. And this particular one is actually signed by ACS, is signed by Azure AD. That long GUID with a 1 and a C as the only thing in it, ACS always has that ID. So if you see something issued by that GUID, it means that it's from ACS. And then the part after the app symbol is the tenant identifier. And we'll see a little bit more about that in a minute when we talk about the rest of the claims in there. But so what SharePoint does is it says, do I trust anybody who has this thumbprint? And when I look up the person that I trust, do I know them by that name, that issuer name? If they do, then SharePoint will accept this request and validate all the rest of the claims in order to set up the context. And we'll talk about what the rest of the claims look like right now. So that's how it validates the issuer. The next important one is called the audience claim. And the audience claim is, who is this token intended for? Who's the audience of this token? And in this particular case, this token is intended for SharePoint. And it's intended for a specific URL in SharePoint and a specific tenant in SharePoint. And the way that I can tell that is that this GUID right here with a 3 and then some goofy-looking characters that are supposed to look vaguely like Office. Anybody catch that? 0FF1CE. Little Easter egg there. That is SharePoint. Exchange is the same thing, but with a 2 instead of a 3. And Link, I think, is the same thing, but with a 4 instead of a 3. So that's what SharePoint will always look like. And so SharePoint's always looking for, does this token have me as an audience? It's always going to validate that portion. The next part after the slash is part of a URL. So this is the URL authority that the token is for. So this one is going to a SharePoint tenant in SharePoint Online that has a URL of fortworth.sharepoint.com. And if SharePoint receives that token for some other URL that's not fortworth.sharepoint.com, it's going to say, well, doesn't match what you're actually trying to call, so this token's not valid for this audience. And then again, that last piece after the @ symbol, we call the realm, or the tenant ID. And this is the identifier of the tenant that was created there for a multi-tenant environment. So this is so that if Contoso and Fabricam both have tenants in SharePoint Online, you can't create a token in Contoso's site and try and use it against Fabricam's site, because Contoso has one GUID there at the end and Fabricam has a different one. Oh, I didn't actually follow my slides there. Oh, all right. The next one is name ID. And name ID is the identifier of the user that you're trying to act on behalf of. So this is a token that's saying the principal that's calling in is trying to talk to SharePoint on behalf of this user, represented by that name ID. And the name ID is interpreted using another claim, the identity provider. And that identity provider says that identifier is good for a user inside Microsoft Online. So when the token shows up at SharePoint, SharePoint says, yep, this is intended for me, and the user here is this name ID. You can actually create app-only tokens that don't have users inside them. And that's how you do that privilege elevation. That's how you make a call that a user may not have been able to do to, for example, approve an expense report. And then the last one that I want to talk about is the actor claim. And the actor claim is the actual app that's making the call. So if we think back to the metaphor of Contoso and SkyDrive, this actor is identifying that it's Contoso calling. So that first GUID there, the E1 EC part, is Contoso's client ID. They probably got that by going to the seller dashboard and saying, hey, give me a new client ID, I want to register for it. They might have used another page inside of SharePoint you might be familiar with called AppRegNew. But they got a client ID, and that identifies Contoso Photo as calling in. And then, like I said, all of these claims have the realm, have the tenant ID sort of appended to them. All right, so that's as down and into the weeds as we're going to get. What I just talked about all the different claims, actually, really, in your day-to-day, when you're actually interacting with this, probably doesn't make much of a difference, unless you're writing a custom library or you're doing all this authentication on a platform where we don't have a library. When I do a demo here in a minute, you'll see that Visual Studio actually handles almost all the creation of these client IDs and the validation of the tokens out of the box inside of its code. But the point of this talk is to really understand how things are going on, how things work under the covers, so that when we talk about the difference between online and on-prem, you'll understand exactly what's changing and understand how to create your app so that it can take into account those things that may change. So let's go back, and we'll go back to this larger diagram. We'll talk about access tokens and issuers again. So we've got our access token. SharePoint's checking to see that thumbprint. Does that thumbprint match a trusted security token issuer that it has? And if it does, it lets it through. Well, let's see what that looks like in the two different environments that we talked about, online and on-prem. In the online environment, we have Azure AD. And what happens with Azure AD is that SharePoint calls into Azure AD when a user installs the app to say, hey, I want to create what's called a delegation. I want this user to allow this app to work on their behalf. And once that thing has been created, the remote app can call Azure AD and say, I'd like an access token. So Azure AD is actually the one creating the access token. And Azure AD has a certificate, a private certificate within Azure AD that it uses to build that access token and sign it. And that access token, that trusted certificate actually has to match the one that SharePoint Online trusts. And in Office 365, we set all this up automatically. So we create a trusted issuer that connects to Azure AD, and we create that ACS proxy that connects to Azure AD. So it's already automatically configured, and all the app has to do is ask Azure AD for an access token, and then send that access token to SharePoint Online. But if we think about the on-premises case, there's no Azure AD. So we don't have an ACS proxy, and that cert that was in Azure AD has to be somewhere. So the on-prem thing actually looks a little bit simpler, where the app actually has this certificate. Let me go back. There's a little bit of a slide bug here that shouldn't say ACS. That certificate, that trusted security token issuer that's on the apps, on the SharePoint side, is actually now the app. So that remote app has a certificate that SharePoint trusts directly, and the app can just create its own access tokens based on whoever the user is and send them over to SharePoint. All right. Does that make sense? We are now, I promise, through the worst of all the deep down technical stuff, and we're going to go back and do a bunch of demos and kind of show how stuff actually works in practice, which is actually a lot easier than I may have made it sound just a minute ago. We good? All right, I see at least a couple heads nodding. It's a good sign. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is really quickly, you guys may have already seen a demo about this, we're just going to build a high-trust app on-prem. And the thing I want to remind you about is when we're in the on-prem case, we don't have ACS. So what we need is a certificate that's trusted by SharePoint and that the app has in order to create the access token. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to configure a SharePoint server, namely this one right here. So this is an on-premises SharePoint server. And we're going to configure this guy using PowerShell to trust the new certificate. Really, this only has to be done once. You can do it per application. You could have a bunch of different certificates that SharePoint trusted, but in practice, most people usually decide to do it once. I've got, let's see, what is it, 4 or 5 lines of PowerShell here that does the trust. The first thing it does is it creates an issuer ID. So this uniquely identifies that issuer. Remember we saw the ISS claim in the token? That's this issuer right here. We're saying this is the name of the person who's going to issue the token. And the second thing it does is it gets the authentication realm of the SharePoint server we're starting to trust. Because remember, we've got that tenant identifier on the end. So we want to make sure that SharePoint's trusting that issuer within that tenant, the one where we want to use this certificate. And then we're grabbing a certificate that I've already created. This one's a self-issued certificate. You can use a certificate issued by a certificate authority. So there's really very little barrier to doing this. I just went into IIS and I clicked Create New Self-Issued Certificate. I exported it, and I've got a certificate file. And then I'm going to construct the full identifier based on the issuer ID and that realm, that tenant ID. And then I'm just going to call this one commandlet called new-sp trusted security token issuer, which, strangely enough, creates a new trusted security token issuer. And it just passes in a name for it. It passes in a certificate, the certificate that it's trusting, and it passes in that registered issuer name that SharePoint's going to try and validate. There's also this flag here called isTrustBroker. And that means that this issuer is allowed to issue tokens for a bunch of different apps. So you don't have to have this. If you want to have one certificate for each individual app, you don't need the isTrustBroker. In this case, I'm going to use the same certificate that I'm going to use for all my demos, so I'm having a single trust broker. I'm just going to copy this stuff, go over into PowerShell, paste it in, hit Enter. This is my new trusted security token issuer, all that information. And that's really as much as it takes to configure that new trusted security token issuer. And Visual Studio actually has a bunch of really cool support for these high-trust apps. So if I go to New Project, New App in SharePoint, and I call this a high-trust app, and again, I maybe not have explained this, we call it high-trust or service-to-service, because in this case, it's high-trust because the app is creating its own access token. It doesn't have to ask for a delegation from ACS. It's creating its own access token, so you have a higher level of trust between the app and SharePoint. So I'll call this high trust example app, and I'll call it 76 just in case I have one. And I'm not going to deploy it to this online site. I'm actually going to deploy it to this on-prem site, SPHVM-57892. That's the one that I just configured. And I'm going to choose provider hosted, because remember we said auto hosted isn't available on-prem. And Visual Studio, if I click next on a provider hosted app, says, do you want to use a client secret? You want to just have a simple sort of username and password thing, which requires a SharePoint farm connected to ACS, or do you want to use a certificate? And this certificate allows me to point at the certificate that I want to use to sign it. It has an issuer ID that it kind of remembers. It remembers from the last time I tried out this demo. And then it asks me for the password for that certificate, because it actually needs to be able to sign with it. So it uses the password. If I hit Finish, Visual Studio is going to create a solution. It's going to put 2 different projects inside of there. One of those projects is the SharePoint app project. The other is a high-trust example app. That thing is just an ASP.NET web project. I could use MVC if I wanted to, but I'm just going to use the default. And I'm just going to do the exact same demo that I did in the authentication talk, this time with high trust. We'll call it custom list. We're going to create a custom list, and then on the page that the app launches to, that we're just going to have a little bit of code that uses an access token to create a list item. So a very simple app. In fact, if I just hit F5 right now, Visual Studio would actually deploy an app that creates an access token and talks back to SharePoint, but it would just get the web's title, so it's not quite what we want. I'm going to go into default.aspx. I'm going to get rid of the default. Like I said, this code will actually just work on F5 because Visual Studio did a bunch of cool work there. I'm going to insert a snippet that just has a create list item function. And all this is doing is using our managed client object model, and it's going to it's going to access the custom list called custom list, and it's going to create a new list item there and set the list item title, and then call the server. So I heard some people saying they've seen a lot of REST this week. This totally works with REST too. In this case, I'm just using managed code. I could use I can use whatever form I want of the client object model in order to access it, and I can still use these access tokens. The other thing is, and I think I actually neglected to import these into Visual Studio, so I'm going to have to copy it from here. I have a snippet that's just 4 lines. And what we're going to do is we're going to grab the web that launched this, the app web, that's sent in the query string when SharePoint launches an app. And then we're going to make one call to get that access token. So I don't have to understand any of the claims or any of the other things that were involved that I was explaining before. I just have one call right here. It's, make that a little bit bigger. It's tokenhelper.get s2s access token with Windows identity. So notice something there. It says with Windows identity. And one of the consequences of using S2S is that if I'm going to create my own token, if I'm going to generate my own token, I have to know what user I'm going to create that token on behalf of, right? So when I use high trust, I actually have to authenticate the user the same way SharePoint does. Alternatively, I can just use an app-only token. I don't have to have a user on the call, so I can make a service-to-service call without authenticating the user. But in this case, I'm going to make the call on behalf of the Windows user who's authenticated here. And this token helper library is just a library, or it's just a code file. So you can actually go to definition. You can look at exactly what the code is here. You can look at exactly how we're generating the claims. You can look exactly how we're building the access token. So if you're interested in all of those details and you want to kind of reverse engineer it, it's all available for you to take a look. But you don't have to if you really just want to get an access token. So this is going to grab that high trust access token. It's going to call create list item and pass in the URL, the access token, and say create with high trust access token. And then the last thing that it's going to do is it's going to do response.write and just put in a link to that custom list so that after it creates the list, we can go and view the list inside of SharePoint and take a look at what it ended up creating and how it understood the identity of that app. So when you install an app, you've got to trust it. You've got to give it permissions to access the things that it wants to access. This page just ran. It's running on my local host. So this is a separate box from the one where SharePoint's running. But because we have this new, more flexible app model where you can kind of host code wherever you want, I can actually even set a breakpoint and refresh this page. I can hit that breakpoint and continue on. And then if I click Link to Custom List, I can see that a couple of list items have been created. And if I click in and look at those list items, you'll actually see that SharePoint understands both of the user identities that are happening here. It says that this was created by High Trust Example App 76 on behalf of Rob Howard. So it knows that it was the app making the call and that the app was making the call on behalf of me. All right, so that's the super simple demo of high trust apps on-prem. Let's go back to the slides, and we'll do maybe 2 or 3 more slides and then jump into another demo. All right, so we saw what apps look like on-prem. There's a cert inside of the remote app. That cert is trusted by SharePoint, so the app can create its own access token and call SharePoint. This is what we call a hybrid SharePoint deployment. And if you look at this picture, it actually looks almost exactly like the online SharePoint deployment. There's only 2 differences. One is that I put hybrid in the title. And the other is that this says SharePoint on-prem. But it still has an ACS proxy. and it still has a trusted security token issuer that is ACS. So the point here is that I can actually take my on-prem farm, and I can configure a trusted security token issuer and an ACS proxy that trust ACS in the cloud, one that I get with an Office 365 environment, in order to have all those same capabilities and interactions with apps that use ACS to authenticate to SharePoint. So this particular scenario is for those folks who have kind of a hybrid environment, or they're moving to the cloud, so they have things on-prem and online, and they want to create a single app that can talk to both. I can configure my SharePoint on-prem environment and my SharePoint online environment to accept the same tokens from that same ACS instance and to be part of that same tenant. And we're a little short on time, but I'm still going to do a really quick demo on how to do that. And then I promise I will point you to exactly where you can go and get the PowerShell script that I have in order to do this as well. So this script is a little bit more complicated, but not too much more complicated. And I will tell you that there is actually another step that's another about 8 or 9 lines of PowerShell that's not in here because I've already done it. And if you do it twice, it kind of messes things up. But it will be in the thing that I link you to. So let's take a look at what this is doing. So the first thing we're doing is we're just grabbing the SharePoint web that we're going to make this configuration in the context of. That's pretty simple. The next is that we're finding something called the ACS metadata endpoint. And all that is that things that use this high trust protocol publish a metadata endpoint that describes, here's the name of my certificate, here's the tenant that I'm a part of, here's the certificate value that you should trust if you want to trust me and tokens that I issue. And so ACS and Azure AD have published a metadata endpoint. It's here at accounts.accesscontrol.windows.net. This is the full URL of it. And then it takes a query string parameter, which is the tenant that you're using this on behalf of. So I have a tenant called fortworth2.onmicrosoft.com. And that's the realm that I'm actually interacting with, the tenant that I'm actually interacting with. And I can actually just go and hit this guy. And it's actually just a JSON document, right? The same way that everything else that we've talking about is JSON. Because everybody knows that curly braces are now cool and pointy braces are not. So you can see this is the metadata document. It has all the keys in there. It has the issuer name. So this is, remember, that GUID that stands for ACS because it's got a 1 and a C. This is the tenant that it's part of. All that kind of information is available here. And all this script does is it goes and grabs that ACS metadata document and grabs the realm from that ACS metadata document and configures the current SharePoint server to be part of that tenant. Remember I said realm is the tenant identifier that keeps Contoso stuff from interacting with Fabricam stuff? This is saying, hey, I'm going to go off to ACS and say, hey, what tenant are you part of? And then it's saying, I want to be part of that tenant too. So it's setting the local authentication realm to be the same one. And then it's creating 2 things. One is that ACS proxy. And this is how SharePoint goes out and says, hey, ACS, this app is allowed to talk on behalf of this user. Remember, it creates that delegation thing. And then this is that same command that we saw earlier, new SP trusted security token issuer. And this time, I'm trusting ACS. And instead of passing the exact certificate and all that information, I can actually just pass the metadata endpoint. I can pass that JSON document endpoint, and SharePoint will go out and read that document and trust the right certs and configure all the right realms and do all that stuff based on what's in the metadata document. And then the last thing is that this is going to configure SharePoint that when it signs its own tokens to talk to ACS, it should use this new realm. It should use the realm that it just got from ACS. So this is actually a pretty simple thing to do. I can just copy this. I can go into another server. I can paste the same in. You can see it takes a little bit of time to go out and get the metadata endpoint. Creating the proxy takes a little bit of time because that's to set it up. Getting the new trusted token issuer takes a little hang up. But it's actually a very straightforward process to go through in order to create this ACS proxy and to create the metadata endpoint. So now I trust tokens that are issued by ACS. And when I do the same sort of online app that I had before and show up with a token from ACS, SharePoint's going to trust it. And I'm more than happy to show you exactly that working, but the demo will look exactly the same as the last one, and we're running short out of time, and there are 2 other things I want to show you. So I'm going to go back to slides. So that's configuring ACS as a trusted issuer on-prem. And just to go back to that scenario again, that scenario is when I have things that are both online and on-prem, and I want to use things in the cloud with my on-prem environment. I want to connect those two environments in a hybrid environment. So we talked about the on-prem environment. We did a demo for that. We talked about hybrid. We did a demo for that. The online one, we covered on Tuesday. If you didn't see my Tuesday talk, you can go check out the video on my SBC. So I won't demo that one. You can take the on-prem environment. You can take the online environment. You've seen both of these things. But you can also create, and I kind of mentioned this before when I asked if people had customers both online and on-prem that they wanted to build a single app for. You can also create a single app that can talk to both. You can have a single code base, a hybrid app. So in this case, SharePoint's not hybrid, but the app is hybrid. And this app knows how to talk to both of these places. It's one app, one code base. It can get a token from Azure AD when it's talking to SharePoint Online. And it can use its own internal certificate when it's talking to SharePoint on-prem. So I'm going to do a really quick demo of that. One other thing I think actually I neglected to say along the way, I apologize, is that the ACS case, so if you look at the top portion of this diagram, you see there are three different parties here. SharePoint creates a delegation with Azure AD. The app gets an access token from Azure AD and then talks to SharePoint. So we call that form of OAuth three-legged OAuth because there are three different people in OAuth. And then the bottom one down here, where we're just creating our own certificate and talking with SharePoint, we call that high trust, or we call it S to S, meaning server to server. There are some other companies that have similar protocols, and they call it two-legged OAuth. So those are all sort of synonyms for the same thing. I realized that I had that in the title of the demo, three-legged OAuth. So I'm going to go back to my machine and go into Visual Studio, and I'm going to create a new project. And I'm going to start with an app for SharePoint. We'll say, oh, thank you. Awesome. Well done. That would have been embarrassing. OK, I'm in Visual Studio. I hit File, New Project. That's all I did, I promise. And now I'm on App for SharePoint 2013. And I'm going to call it Hybrid App Demo. We'll call it 54. And hit OK. Like I said, instead of starting with the on-prem thing, I'm actually going to choose my online tenant, this Fort Worth 2 SharePoint.com tenant. And I'm going to choose provider hosted. I'm just going to hit finish to start with. Oh, no, that is not what I wanted to do. We're going to open another Visual Studio instance. Sorry. I practiced too many different demos. I get mixed up along the way. OK, let's try this one more time. We're going to go New Project. We're going to go App for SharePoint. We'll call it Hybrid App Demo. What was that, 56? This will be 57 or 59 or something. And I'll hit OK. And actually, we want to start on-prem. Either way actually works, but the demo is going to be faster if I start on-prem. So we're going to do that same server that I created a high-trust app first. I'm going to choose provider hosted. I'm going to choose to use a client certificate and call it pass@word1. And I'll explain why I did it in that direction. And that is that the Visual Studio tools actually do a bunch of work for me when I say I want to use a certificate. And that work includes two things. One is it creates that certificate and puts all the information in the web config file. So I can actually go and look at the web config here. It has my client certificate path, my client certificate password. It's a very secure password. And then it has an issuer ID, right? But it also created a client secret. So Visual Studio, when I do it this way, actually automatically handles creating everything I need for both online and on-prem. It's just by default, it's only using the on-prem stuff. So that's why I chose that I wanted to do it in that direction. So if I go into default.aspx, I can go in here and again replace this code. In the interest of time, I'm going to go with a very quick demo. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to reproduce this block twice. And what this block does is, it's the default code in Visual Studio. It just grabs the current web, gets the title from that web and then writes the title to the page. And you can see that I've got a context token here that's get S2S client context with Windows identity. So that's going to be for the high trust case. I want to also have a case that is for when it's not high trust. When it's not high trust, I use a context token. If you're not familiar with the context token, you can check out the talk on Tuesday. But I'll capture that here. So I'll say context token string equals token helper dot get context token from request, and pass in the current request. And that's going to check and see, did SharePoint send me a context token on the current call? And what I want to do is if the context token string is null or empty, so if there is no context token string, then I'm going to assume I'm in this S2S case. And I can do a little bit more advanced heuristic, but that's really 97% of the logic, is to say if I don't have a context token string, I can try and use S2S to communicate with them. And if I do have a context token string, I'm going to use a different method inside token helper to create the client context. So I'll say token helper dot get client context with context token, cleverly named. We'll pass the host web to string, the context token string, and the current URL's authority. We're passing in the current URL's authority so that that the app can make sure that the context token it got's really intended for this URL. That's all that's used for. All right. So if I hit F5, let me set a couple of breakpoints here. If I hit F5 with this, what it's going to do is, remember, I configured it to go against my on-prem server, the same one that I configured that trusted issuer with. So the first part of this demo is going to look extremely similar to the last one that I showed. I'll hit trust it here. We're going to hit a breakpoint. We're in this high trust case because there was no context token string, right? I'll hit continue on. And you can see that it was able to get the title of that site. Remember, this is coming from a remote site that doesn't have my login. You can see it says dev site on-prem. So that's the dev site that I deployed it to in my on-premises box. And now I'm going to go and deploy the exact same app to SharePoint Online. And I'm going to do this in kind of a shortcut way. I'll also describe to you how to do it in the normal way that you would do for production, but that's a pretty cool video. So I'm in my dev site, and what I need to do here is this app was created in the context of my local SharePoint server, my on-prem SharePoint server. So my online SharePoint server doesn't know anything about this identity. And I can solve that in a couple of ways. If I'm going to use this app in a bunch of different tenants or sell it in the store, I'd actually go to the seller dashboard, the same place I go to submit an app. And I would create a new app ID there, and it could be used in all different tenants. In this case, I really only want to use the app in this one tenant. So I have a page inside of SharePoint that can just create me a new app ID or register a new app. And it's at _layout/15/appreg_new.aspx. And if I go into Visual Studio, in the running app, and I go into Solution Explorer and I look in web.config, you can see that it's auto-generated a client ID for me. So what I want to do is just register that same client ID and the same secret. And I can give it a display name. I'll call this hybrid demo test. And then I have to register the URL where this app is being run. I think that was, 44.13. And I'll hit create. And then I'm going to do one other thing to take a shortcut, which is I'm going to kind of cheat, and I'm going to go and use the exact same project, the exact same app. We chose 59, right? You guys watching? I'm going to choose that exact same app package that Visual Studio has deployed to my on-prem one, and I'm just going to go back to my dev site. And I'm going to upload that same package to this dev site. and deploy it. So it'll take just a second for it to install. Hybrid App Demo 59. What it's doing right now is it's creating all the connections with the identity in ACS that we registered with AppReg New. Remember, we have on my local machine, on my laptop that's running right here, we have this app locally registered. We also have the app running on-prem against the on-prem service. And now we have it registered that same package in my online service. I think I still have those breakpoints set. So we should see, here's the one we would expect it to come into, because we should get a context token when we're online. If I click to launch it, it should generate that context token. And sure enough, we hit a breakpoint. Oh no. I messed up the client ID. So this will be an interesting little teaching exercise here. So we got an audience URI validation failed exception. Remember when I showed you all the different claims that were in the access token, and I showed you AUD, I showed you the audience claim. That audience claim had the client ID that we were targeting, it had the host URL, the location that we were targeting, and the realm. And what this is saying is that this app got a context token that wasn't intended for it. It was intended for this ID, and this is the actual intended audience of the context token. So I actually grabbed the wrong app package in order to install it there. But we're just going to see what's the best way to go. So you can see this full URL here. This is the actual exception. So it's saying this audience wasn't the right audience. So it expects to get a token for this guy, and it actually got a token with an audience of the other guy. I must have picked the wrong app package. What's that? 57? Is that what I did wrong? I don't have a 57. Oh, no, it was 59. It was 59. Well, I'll have to take a look at exactly why I got the wrong app package, but we're running out of time, so I want to make sure and close it up. The general thing here is that this app is now being called from both places. It's got a context token coming in from one location. It's got the STS identity coming in from another location. And you can see that both of them were interacting with the exact same app. So this app can now bridge the gap between online and on-prem identities. What you would actually do if you wanted to deploy this for production, instead of trying to do the hacky thing that I tried to do that actually apparently didn't work, is if you go into the project and you right-click on it, there's a publish option here. And when I click publish, I can create a new profile for this app. And I can say, here's the website that I'm going to host it on for production. I can say, here's the client ID and the secret that I'm going to use for production. So you don't do the hacky thing where you try and get them matched up, but I obviously didn't do it right. And you can create that client ID in the seller dashboard or in AppReg New the same way that I did. And I'll just put a couple of things inside there so that we can finish it out. I'll put a client ID in there. I'll put a secret in there. I'll hit next. When I hit finish, you'll see what I actually get on the other end is my finished app package. And if you do it this way, and don't try and take the shortcut I did, you can then take this exact same app package and upload it both places, so you know you'll get the same app ID in both places. And then the other thing you get is a web deploy package here. A web deploy package is a nifty thing that I can deploy up into Azure if I want to. I can deploy it into an on-prem IaaS server. So I have this package that allows me to consistently take the same bits and move them into a bunch of different locations and deploy them in a consistent way across them. So Visual Studio has created both my app package, which is the one I'm going to use to register with SharePoint, and the web deploy package, and given me that opportunity to now go and deploy this to production. When I go back to the slides, I want to show one more thing. And that is that we talked about this hybrid app. We talked about creating a single app that works in both SharePoint Online and in SharePoint On-Prem. But actually, in practice, if this remote app is running in the cloud, if you're hosting the remote app in the cloud on the storefront, for example, your code base isn't going to be able to reach into a SharePoint On-Prem farm because there's probably a firewall there. So if you have a customer who's really on-prem, they're not a hybrid customer, they're really and truly on-prem, then that thing that I showed at the end when I hit publish on the Visual Studio dialog is very important. Because you can take that same web deploy package and you can deploy both to Azure in the cloud or to whatever hosting infrastructure you want in the cloud. And you can separately then deploy that web deploy package behind the firewall, either on the same servers that are serving SharePoint or on another set of servers that they'd like to run that one application on. And as a result, when you do it that way, you can take a single code base, you can take a single set of code in Visual Studio, a single project, and you can serve both of those needs. You can have your on-prem version of the product and your online version of the product all be written using the same code. All right, so we are out of time. I'm 1 minute over. I'll give you my super quick takeaway. First is that the new cloud app model is all about working both on-prem and in the cloud. Should use high trust or S2S when you're in pure on-prem environments. And if you're a customer who's spanning on-prem and online, you can create a hybrid configuration. But no matter what that configuration looks like, you can build a single hybrid app that connects to all of them, whether it's an on-prem server or an online server or a hybrid server, and use a single code base to interact with them as a partner selling your product. So I hope this was helpful. Sorry about the demo fail. I hope you guys will give me feedback on my SBC so I can make sure it's even more helpful next time. And I hope you guys have a good rest of the conference.